talk to you about. I have been very lucky in my career to be involved in a number of interesting lines of work, all related to space. I'm a planetary scientist by training. I actually started off as an engineer and then went back to graduate school at 30 years old. Took a PhD in astrophysics, went into planetary science, and worked on the origin of the solar system and on the architecture of the deep outer solar system. Felt like I was making great contributions, was able to build a very large department of researchers, much like the SETI Institute, at a place called the Southwest Research Institute. I became a instrument principal investigator, and then a mission principal investigator, and I lead NASA's mission to Pluto. It's called New Horizons. And then I became the associate administrator for science at NASA and ran the whole science program. And I've had a chance to do airborne astronomy. I spent 5 years at Edwards Air Force Base flying F-18s. It's really been a great career, but nothing in that career has approached what I have seen that is now budding in commercial spaceflight. Because I think it really opens up our horizons in so many ways. And I only have 20 minutes, not one, but 20 minutes, but I want to tell you a little bit about commercial spaceflight. Before I do that, I have two questions to ask of the audience. And the first is, how many of you at some point watched very much of Star Trek? A lot of people. I guess I'm not surprised. Great. How many of you, if you would indulge me again, how many of you were hopeful about that future? Look at that. That's fantastic. Well, we'll see where that leads. Now, watch me hit the reverse instead of the forward. I'm going to start a little ways back. 1903, with a wooden airplane flown by the Wright brothers that began the air age. And it's interesting how quickly the air age developed. In the space of a very short period of time, we went from the very first suborbital flights, right? What was this, a 10-second flight? A couple of 100 feet, maybe 100 meters. Within a decade, there were commercial companies building airplanes. Within a little over 2 decades, there were early primitive airlines. By the time 50 years had gone by, airlines were commonplace, and I love this picture. It's not just because it's so 1950s, but because of, look at that kid. He is more interested in the chicken than in the view out the window because airplane flight had become so commonplace. What happened to space flight? It started off pretty fast. I was born the year of Sputnik. By the time I was 4 years old, human beings were flying in space on short suborbital flights. About the time that I was 10, and remember, I was born the year of Sputnik. In 10 years flat, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were doing this. And that was repeated that November by another Apollo crew, and repeated again and again in my boyhood, with increasingly sophisticated explorations of the moon. It was something out of science fiction. Arthur C. Clarke, the author of so many science fiction and science fact articles and books, said that the 1960s were, in a way, a decade plucked out of the 21st century and dropped in the middle of the 20th. I don't think he knew how right he was when he said that in 1969. This is what we expected in 1969. This is a movie many of you have probably seen. It came out in 1968. And I remember seeing it as a boy and thinking, I couldn't wait to be part of that future. And that it seemed about right that we should have a moon base of about that scale 40 years, 35 years down the road in 2001. Because things were moving so fast. We'd gone from no space flight at all to expedition after expedition after expedition. In the late 1960s, NASA and the administration were looking at first Mars landing in 1981. And there were no technical showstoppers to doing that. It was a question of money. That money never appeared. Ever wonder why? a very large number of cooks got involved in the kitchen. This particular kitchen. And I don't know how many of you ever go in the back of the restaurant of a fine restaurant and ask the chef what the optimal number of cooks in the kitchen is. I'm pretty sure there's no chef that ever answers 535. Well, as a result of the politics of the day, we took that capability to explore planets and we threw it away. It simply stopped. We voluntarily retreated from that. And I think a lot of people in the time thought it was a pretty brief retreat. But what that political establishment gave us, something very different. A magnificent flying machine called the Space Shuttle that never went any further from the Earth than Los Angeles is from here. And it flew very successfully and did many good things, and ultimately constructed a space station that's now in Earth orbit with 6 astronauts there. But it took us out of the exploration business. And we have for 40 years been out of exploration. Largely because we have only one space program. It is a government-led space program. It's nothing like the way that aviation developed with private companies and lots of innovation and numerous entrepreneurs, people who staked their fortunes on aviation with names like McDonnell and Douglas or Lockheed or Grumman, and you can name the others. We haven't had anything like that in spaceflight until very recently. But it began about 8 years ago when Burt Rutan, the legendary airplane designer, decided to become involved in something called the X Prize, which was a challenge that Peter Diamandis put together for the first private human spaceflight to just go up and back down very briefly into space. And to do that on a repeatable basis. And Burt, who's a genius, designed a system that cost less than most individual cameras on NASA planetary missions. He designed, conceived, tested, and carried out a human spaceflight program for under $30 million, won the X Prize, and the day that he won it, in October of 2004, he appeared at the microphone with a certain Richard Branson, who announced that they were going to commercialize this. They were going to monetize it. They were going to create a space line for anybody that's interested and had the wherewithal and the funds to fly on a successor system, a much larger system than this, and they have now built it. And it is out test flying. And I'll predict to you today that within a year they'll fly it to space, possibly by the end of this year, at least with test pilots. And that by sometime in the next 2 years, they'll be flying it with tourists and with researchers like myself. And I'm not just making that up. My group in Boulder has 9 space flights that we have bought for research purposes. Just our little group on the corner of Walnut Street and 11th in Boulder has 9 space flights. That's more than the entire U.S. astronaut corps in Houston has in the next 3 years. That's fact. But this isn't where it ends. This is where it begins. Some of you have seen drawings like this of space capsules. They seem pretty retro, but they're really about the future. This is a capsule called Dragon, which has recently been in the news. Dragon was conceived by a company called SpaceX, which is a contraction for Space Exploration Technology Company. The guy that founded the company is named Elon Musk, and some of you know who that is. Elon made his money in the internet, but wanted to go to space. And he started SpaceX in 2002 and has become the dominant force in commercial spaceflight. He is something like the Carnegie of commercial spaceflight. He's still a very young man. He just turned 40, and his company has designed rockets and capsules and taken them to flight. And it wasn't easy. The first rocket blew up. Everybody said, that guy will learn his lesson, that internet guy going in the aerospace business. He's playing with fire now. He knew he was playing with fire, and he kept spending his own money, and so he put a second rocket up, and it failed. So he put a third one up with his own money, and it didn't work. It failed. So he put a fourth one up. That's the American spirit. He put a fourth one up and it went to orbit, and so did the fifth and the sixth and the seventh and the eighth. On his most recent flight, this vehicle, called Falcon 9 because it has 9 engines, not just orbited an unmanned spacecraft, the first company ever to do this in the history of humankind, something that only nation states had done in the past. But he actually flew it to space station, where it docked and delivered supplies and returned goods from the space station completely successfully on its first try. Pretty amazing. But that's not where it starts. That's where it begins. That's not where it ends. That's where it begins. Because others are getting into this game. Elon has competition from companies like Sierra Nevada, that's building that space plane. Boeing Company, there in your lower right, is building another kind of capsule. And they're all competing to fly commercially in space, to fly tourists and researchers, to haul cargo back and forth to the space station, to do it on a regular basis, to do it for fixed price contracts, and to do it in a newer, leaner way. Here's an example of how much leaner. When I was at NASA as associate administrator, we were building a moon rocket called Ares. We invested $10 billion and we got one suborbital flight out of that $10 billion. During the same period of time, SpaceX invested $300 million and developed the Falcon line of rockets. They conceived, designed, built, tested, and flew the first one to orbit for about $300 million. That's what we at NASA built the launch tower for Ares for. Same amount of money. Now, the guys that are building capsules and rockets aren't alone. Bob Bigelow made a fortune in Hotel Suites of America. Now he's taking it to space. He had a brilliant idea. We have a space station. There are something like 15 countries involved. But if you look on Wikipedia, that means that there are about 180 countries that are left out of the game. Well, maybe I'll build my own space station and I'll rent it out by the week and by the month. And instead of a $100 billion enterprise, this is going to be something like a $1 billion investment. And I can actually offer attractive stays for research teams from other countries for tens of millions of dollars per month. Completely a game changer on price. And if you don't think Bob is serious, besides being very successful already in his career, he's got 2 space stations that have been on orbit now for years doing unmanned tests. And this is his factory. It's in Las Vegas. That's Bob in the white shirt in the middle. These are large structures, and they are perfectly serious. They're going to put these in orbit. They're going to use vehicles like Dragon or others to transport crews back and forth for that other 180 countries that got left out of the mix. And then there's Elon. Come back to SpaceX. Elon's goal is Mars. It's a good thing he's a young man. But he's not that young. He's got a version of Dragon he's out touting now to NASA that can do Mars robotic landings at very low prices compared to what we design our own spacecraft for. It's called Red Dragon. And he envisions landings like this on the surface to do everything from scientific exploration to sample return. But he's not stopping there. This is where his interest lies. Elon, at the vanguard of the commercial space industry, wants to send humans to Mars. He's not looking for NASA dollars to do it. He's looking to do it in the private sector. And we're hearing now the beginnings of private companies that are talking about lunar exploration. You may have heard of Excalibur Almaz, for example, or Space Adventures. And I believe that there are others that are on the horizon as well that are going to take us back to the moon and probably beat the Chinese there as private companies. And I don't think that it's so far-fetched in a commercial space world to imagine, perhaps a little later than 2001, that we will have large, significant presence on the moon, and not very far off, certainly within the lifetime of people in this room. You see, I brought up Star Trek for a reason, because it's my belief that commercial space is where Star Trek begins. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan. It's been pointed out to me that the live action tomorrow afternoon also includes a trip to watch a SpaceX launch at Kennedy. So if you're not feeling exhausted, you could watch a launch. All right, nobody gets the puns. By the way, in terms of Alan Stern, I would say that you should probably get his autograph now before he goes into space, because once he's done so, it'll probably be a lot more expensive. Our next speaker on the future of space exploration is Mae Jemison. And Mae Jemison, unlike you, Alan, Mae has already been in this space. She was on the Shuttle Endeavour, right, Mae? Yeah, the Shuttle Endeavour. And she is now heading up the 100-year Starship program, which I hope she'll say something about. Mae Jemison.
Good evening. I am going to actually stand behind the podium a little bit because I have some things that I really, really want to talk about. The first thing I'm just going to tell you is that I am so excited to be here today. I'm really excited. I got to hear some wonderful talks even before we get settled in really well. And the other part of it I'm so excited is because SETI is one of those organizations that has been around and has not been afraid to move things forward. And so I'm really excited to have been a part of this. What I want to do is to take a little bit of time and to share with you and bring a perspective about a vision of being in space, of what we're going to do in the future. And that perspective is both personal, and it also comes from the team that I have the privilege of working with. So I'm going to start off by telling you a story about a little girl. So it's really interesting because Alan and our talks are somewhat similar. We're starting in different places. But I also was born a little bit before Alan in terms of 1956, just before Sputnik. And I grew up on the south side of Chicago. And I remember lying outside on a summer's night. And I would stare up at the stars with all my young imagination and intensity. And I would imagine myself there among them. I always assumed that I would go into space. It was something that was incredibly wonderful. And there was something interesting that was happening that I think has a lot to do with where we see ourselves in space today. When I looked at the images of space, I didn't see myself there. Even though women had done, there's a Mercury 13 who were tested for the astronaut program. They did as well as, actually they did better than the men did, but they weren't there. And so one of the things that has always influenced me and will continue to influence me is how do we get everyone involved? Well, one of the things that happened with me, let's see if this is working. So I stared at space. I just thought it was wonderful. But one of the places that we all had to revert to, and we just heard it, is we had to revert to Star Trek, right? So it was part of the places we had to go. And we did not plan this. He ended on Star Trek. I'm starting on Star Trek. But, you know, when we revert back to science fiction, it was because the science fiction was so powerful. It told such wonderful stories about who we could be, what the world might be, and what we hope for. And it's not something that we should throw away. It's something that we should hold on to and aspire to. So trying to do that at the same time, that is me. On the bridge of the Starship. I just had to show that. I didn't know where else to do it. But because these things are really important to us. It's how we imagine the world to be. It is the kinds of possibilities we come up with. Now, right now, when we talk about the future of space exploration, I think it's important for us to understand that we're at a really critical juncture right now. So we heard about how commercial spaceflight is moving ahead. But we have to remember the reason commercial spaceflight can move ahead so rapidly is because they are building on the base of what governments had done, the base of the investment in which individuals across the United States, taxpayers, the kinds of things we had done. We already had solved a lot of the really difficult issues associated with that kind of space exploration, with low Earth orbit. But we're at a critical juncture right now because we have the knowledge base to know that incredible things happen to our world with space exploration. If you just go back to the 1960s, we know that the trends in miniaturization occurred, the trends in being able to remotely sense things. We don't even have to talk about global positioning satellites systems, which people use their GPS and they forget it's in space, but that's okay. These are things that we know can happen. But what are we going to do? Are we going to stay in our own galactic neighborhood? Are we going to be able to go into the furthest reaches? We're poised right now to use a vantage point of space for information about the planets in our solar systems to understand our Earth, to understand the evolution of our planet. We're poised to be able to facilitate global aspirations and ambitions using space as a platform. What those global aspirations and ambitions are, again, depends on who participates. And whether we even go any further depends on who participates. Who do we get to be involved? Now, we can say from the sci-fi movies that we know we're going to go into space because every sci-fi movie has humans in space, right? Space is either the main character or it's just the backdrop, right? So because sci-fi was so right about tablet computers, communication satellites, when you walk through the security systems and they were right about all those kind of things. They were right about liposuction, all of that. So I know that they're going to be right about space, but there's still some fundamental questions. Who's going to participate? And those people set the choices, the objectives, and everything. What are we going to do with it? Will and Ariel Durant said the future never just happened, it was created. And that's the piece that we have to go with. We get the chance to create what's going on. I'm proud to be leading the team that is working on a 100-year Starship, which is a non-governmental organization to try to make human interstellar flight a reality within the next 100 years, that we can travel to another star system. And in the process of doing that, it's important for us to get a handle on what that challenge seems like. What is the challenge? So it's basically, if we think of ourselves here in Santa Clara, and I got this from one of my team members, who's Dr. Richard Obusi, who's in the audience here. If we're here in Santa Clara, and then we want to get over to New York City, there's a certain amount of distance. It's over about 3,000 miles, at least, that we have to go. Think about Santa Clara as Earth and Alpha Centauri is New York City, if we use that kind of a scale. And we want to get there. Let's think about the object that's furthest from Earth right now. It's Voyager, right? And it's traveling over 2 astronomical units a year. 93 million miles is 1 astronomical unit, so it's traveling over somewhere over 200 million miles a year, somewhere around 200 million miles a year. It's been traveling since 1977. And on this scale, it would have only gone 1 mile. That's the challenge. It will have only gone 1 mile. So the challenge that we have when we look at interstellar flight is that we have to go faster. Gotta go a little bit faster. And that really determines everything that we look at. As we go faster, it means that we have to have better energy systems, better propulsion. Well, the propulsion will get you so far, but you need energy because even if you start approaching the speed of light and you go 1,000 times faster, it's still going to take you 50 years to get there. And in between the stars, we actually don't have a lot of light, so we can't use solar power. We have to figure out how to generate a tremendous amounts of energy. We have to understand how to navigate, because if you're going really, really fast, you have to avoid things. And if you're going really, really fast and you go off track, right? You can end up someplace you didn't intend to. We don't have those kinds of navigation systems right now. We don't have that kind of remote sensing capabilities right now. Those are some of the pieces that are the challenges. I would also say that this is almost like getting dressed up and going to your prom, right? Because you need to know where you're going to go. We don't know exactly where we're going to go. Right now, the exoplanet folks help me out. We don't know anything very much about Alpha Centauri. That doesn't look like there's anything there. That might not be a really exciting place to go, but it's the closest star system to us. So where do we go? We have to understand that. Then we have to understand what dress we're going to wear. Guys, what tuxedo you're going to wear? Is it going to be that awful blue tuxedo? No, we have to understand a habitat, the vehicles, the design of the vehicles, the materials that they're made out of, because we don't have very much experience right now with the kinds of materials that can be in those kinds of conditions for long periods of time. We have to understand what happens to humans. We're in a completely different radiation environment. Even when they would tell people in the shuttle, you know, you got to go huddle, or the space station, there's going to be some kind of radiation phenomenon. This is a completely different set of circumstances. So we have to understand a lot more about radiation and human physiology and habitat. And then finally, we have to figure out who we want to go with. Right? Who gets to go? And in what form do they go? Do they go as to be reconstituted on the other side? Is that human? Is that what we want to pass through? So there are a lot of questions that are affiliated with what do we do to go there. I am pleased to be working with this incredibly talented group of people. The Dorothy Jemison Foundation for Excellence is a prime. I have really wonderful people we're working with. Aliris Allman is here, who's working with us, and she came from, we stole her from Avaya, we talked her into it. We call her, she's a behavioral psychologist, and she reminds us every day that the social science issues are as difficult as any other. Those social science issues, remember, aren't just the ones that are affiliated with what happens on the vehicle, but how do we maintain that commitment? Right? What are some of the economic issues? What goes on as we're getting ready to go and we're prepared? Icarus Interstellar, which is this phenomenal group of scientists, engineers, folks who want to understand how, they've been working on building a probe for 2 years, an interstellar probe, a theoretical thought mission. Then Foundation for Enterprise Development is an organization that does technology and governance work. And the other person of the other organization, it feels like a person, who we're really proud to have was SETI, came on as a member. We have a relationship with SETI where as soon as we get really up and running, we'll be able to exchange fellows and other things to be able to help us understand where we want to go and do we really want to talk to those people when we get there. What 100-Year Starship, our organization, is really set up not to necessarily be the one that mounts the mission, but we want to be able to make sure that the environment is super saturated enough with different kinds of technologies and thoughts and ideas that if someone decides to create that kind of mission within the next 100 years, they'll be able to do it. And I can tell you, even though we talk about someone being able to do it, I'm going to share with you a little secret. If we can get this going in 30 years, we get the right kind of anti-aging stuff, and we can do suspended animation, I'm going. So that's the challenge we have right now. It's just a little secret. The title of our proposal that we gave to DARPA that allowed us to, that really speaks to our vision is here: an inclusive, audacious journey transforms life here on Earth and beyond. And there are really particular reasons why we say that. The whole term about inclusive, let's see, oops, I keep doing the wrong one. Inclusive is, I believe, that it's not just those people that we were shown in the big congressional hall. They're not the reason why there's no life, there's no human activity on the moon right now. The reason I believe it's not there is because we'd include everyone. There were so many people who could not see themselves involved in space exploration and involved in the lunar landing. So it was like, yeah, we rooted for it. We said, yeah, we want to be there, and we beat the Russians, or whatever the reason was. It was a tremendous feat. But so many people looked around, they didn't see how or understand how it impacted them, their children, their daughters, their sons, their world, even though we know it impacted the world, but that message wasn't carried across. They weren't included. When I think of this, the reason why this is so important that we pay attention to inclusion, because those are the folks who are going to rally for us, are going to rally for the mission later on. They're the ones who are going to say, when Congress wants to say, oh gosh, we're not going to build a superconducting super collider even though we're halfway there, and we need to really know about antimatter. We can only do that at CERN right now. They're the folks who are going to say, no, the science is worth doing. I think that's a really important place where you have to understand that space exploration cannot be seen only for rocket scientists and billionaires. It has to have a much more important perspective. We think about inclusion that way, that it runs a gamut not just of ethnicity and gender, but of geography, of disciplines. 2 days ago, I was in Washington, D.C., at the African Art Museum of the Smithsonian, and they were holding an exhibit on African art and the cosmos. It was sponsored by the South African government. And the South African ambassador to the United States was there, and he mentioned that, you know, they got the Square Kilometer Array, the world's largest radio telescope. And he talked about how Africa says it is going to be a part of the future and right now, and that's one of the things they're working for. We're not going to do this all by ourselves, so we already have to pay attention to and know that this is going to happen. And yes, China will get to the moon, because they intend to do it. Inclusion is very important. The public never lost their fascination with space. They were just left out. We have to keep them involved. And our mission will most likely fail if it has an exclusionary posture that only some small subset of people can fathom, less longer hope to participate. It has to be broader than that. We have to be audacious, right? You don't get to do this just by pretending, right? And saying, I sort of want to do it. You have to be willing to take risk. Again, that's one of the things that I'm so proud of SETI, is because it takes risk. It thinks about things in a much different fashion. We got to stay. We're going to get another quote from some other peer person soon, but you know, my favorite quote from Q, right? If you can't take a little bloody nose, maybe you had better go back home and crawl under your bed. It's not safe out here. It's wondrous with treasures to satiate desires both subtle and gross, but it's not for the timid, and neither is getting to the stars. We have to be willing to say this is something worthwhile doing. And then finally, the idea of transforming life here on Earth. So people ask the question, why are you going to do this? Well, we know we can go back and say it's going to do all these wonderful things. It's going to create energy. We have to learn about self-renewing ships. We have to do all these incredible things. But people want to know that it's going to make a difference, not just 100 years from now, not just 50 years from now, but it'll make a difference 5 years from now, that it'll make a difference today. And our whole thought process is that as we work to achieve a grand challenge for tomorrow, we'll have the opportunity. We know we'll build a better world today. That's the piece. Every day, step by step, it has to be part of what we do. We have to be willing to transform life here on Earth for the better. And then finally, you know, you have to stay on target. You can't get distracted. You can't say, well, I found this really cool thing and I'm just going to go make some money off of that one, right? You have to have your purpose is clear. We're planning on going to another star system. That's where we're going. And when people ask you, is this really crazy? I think we already know this. We got the history of what was going on in how quickly we got to the moon. When people say, is the idea of going to another star system really reasonable? Then I would say yes, it is. Because we know that in 1901, when H.G. Wells wrote First Man on the Moon, it was really a fantastical idea. But in less than 70 years, we were able to actually get to the moon, and our technological arc was much less than it is now. We know that we can gain the technological knowledge base much faster. When people ask me what is the most incredible thing about human space exploration, I know that they're always wanting me to say it was going to the moon. And I always feel bad when I don't tell them that that's what it is. You know, I think in terms of modern day space exploration, Voyager is probably the coolest thing. Because imagine something that we created is outside of our solar system, is the most phenomenal thing. But the most extraordinary part of space exploration for me is when one of my ancestors, 1,000 generations before me, looked up at a star-studded sky, reached out our hand, couldn't touch them, and then began to track the movements of the heavens. There are people who figured out the stars were moving relative to each other. They didn't have photographic plates, no computer algorithms. They had dark adapted eyes, and they sat out and they said, you know, Bob, about 5 years ago, those stars, that was over there. That's an incredible feat. In every society around the world, in every culture, there were people who did that. Space exploration is a birthright that we all have. It is as old as humanity itself. And with our voyage into the stars, we continue that. And so what I would tell you, to tell folks when they are concerned with whether or not we should continue on, whether or not this is a reasonable thing to do, whether or not you're kind of crazy, I would quote Cynthia Himmel. She said, when in doubt, make a fool of yourself. There is a microscopically thin line between being brilliant and acting like the most gigantic idiot on earth. So what the hell, leap. Thank you.
Thanks so much, May. The future of space exploration, Alan Stern, May Jemison, and by the way, their immediate future is to be on several panels during the weekend, so you can see them again. I like the idea of New York as Alpha Centauri because I knew it wasn't serious. The crowd, which was not attractive to begin with, has turned ugly. How many of you, how many of you have ever want to or have ever wanted to go into space? I'm just sort of curious. Probably all of you, yeah, nearly. You know, the idea of what to send, I thought that was a good point, May, because in fact, you know that all the information in the sperm and egg that made you would fit on one CD. So if we could just send a hard drive to Alpha Centauri, we could send everybody in this hotel. Mind you, they wouldn't have the college education, but we all know that's kind of minimal in terms of information. Okay, well, SETICon, how you doing there? You need a, okay, David's hooking